Hi, thank you for coming. Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties. So I'll be talking about ecological rewilding, particularly in Europe. But before jumping into the subject, I wanted to put things into context and discuss why we're even talking about rewilding in Europe, though you already had some answers in the previous talk. But the reason behind this is that indeed we are seeing a new availability of land for nature. And as you already heard, this is quite a global trend. So if you look at the gray bars, I'm not sure you can see it very well, but you can see that there has been land abandonment, agricultural land abandonment occurring in the world. In Europe, this is a trend that started after the Second World War. But what is quite striking about Europe is when we look at predictions of land abandonment for the decades to come. And this is done with data from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment scenarios, but this is quite consistent with other scenario exercise. And overall, we can estimate that about 15% of the agricultural land of Europe could be abandoned in the next decades. But indeed, if we look at what happened recently, this map here shows you trajectories of land use change between 1992 and 2006. You can see that the main transition that were observed in the Mediterranean system were forest expansion over grassland and a cropland grassland conversion. To a lesser extent, there was also some loss of permanent cropland. Now let's look into the future. These are 4 scenarios of the Volante project, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure you can see it very well in the back. But for the Mediterranean system, the projections of land use change are quite consistent across the 4 scenarios. And those transitions are de-intensification of cropland and pasture, forest expansion again, land abandonment, and to a lesser extent, some expansion of wild areas. So there is really potential to have new land for nature. And in this context, we can consider that rewilding and ecological rewilding is an opportunity for restoration. Rewilding is a rather recent and young concept. However, there's already been several approaches suggested on how to do rewilding. All those approaches can pretty much be placed in a gradient of the intensity of intervention from passive to active and the age of the restoration baseline that you want to consider from the recent Anthropocene to the Pleistocene. And those approaches go from, for instance, supporting natural recolonization to reintroduction, and in some cases, the introduction of ecological replacements. And you can easily see that the further you go along this gradient, the higher your ecological uncertainty becomes and the higher the risk for conflict. So when I talk about ecological rewilding, we're pretty much placing ourselves on this bottom left angle here with low to no management intervention and a rather recent baseline. So ecological rewilding is defined as the passive management of ecological succession with the goal of restoring natural ecosystem process, but also to reduce the human control of the landscape. It's focused on preserving and restoring the structural and the functional complexity of degraded ecosystems. And that also means restoring wild species interactions because of their role on regulating key ecosystem processes such as nutrient flow and vegetation succession. And this also led us to propose a rewilding hypothesis that considers that the large-scale restoration of those apex consumers and large herbivores will promote self-regulation in community assemblages and increase the complexity of processes in the systems. But this is all very conceptual, so I also wanted to present you some results, quite preliminary results from studies that we're doing in northern Portugal, in the Peneda Gerês National Park, actually in the parish of Castro Laboreiro. And in this area, we've done 2 studies. One is setting up some exclosure experiments with control plots that were monitored by camera traps. And we also deployed a grid of camera traps that were covering pretty much all the types of habitats that we could find here, which were low shrub, tall shrub, oak forest, and agricultural fields. So in the exclosure, this experiment ran for a little more than a year, and different measurements were done. So we collected data on the vegetation, so the richness of species, the height of the seedlings, but also on the pressure of herbivory and the richness of herbivores. So these preliminary results that I'm showing you here show here the distribution and height of the seedlings at the beginning of the experiment. So in pink you can see the exclosure, and in blue the control. And so you can see that at the beginning the distribution of height is pretty similar between exclosure and control. It's actually, you have slightly taller seedlings in the control. But a little more than a year after, the structure in height has completely changed between the exclosures and the control. And the exclosure have the tallest seedlings in this experiment. So this shows that there has been an effect of herbivory, or the exclosure from herbivory, in this experiment. Now, when we use the camera traps, what we can do is look at the interaction, both spatial and temporal, between the different species of large herbivores, and also comparing domestic and wild herbivores. So what this shows you, and this is just using a sample of the data, so only part of the camera traps and only for a shorter period of time, is that the most common large herbivore in this system is a roe deer. It's present on pretty much all the sites. However, the density, of course, of cattle and horse is much, much higher. And we can use those data to do some species occupancy models and test, for instance, the probability of presence of a given herbivore given the presence or absence of another herbivore, and introducing other covariates, such as, for instance, the cover or different land cover and land uses. So here this example shows you the probability of presence of the wild boar dependent on the presence or absence of the horses and the cover of low shrub. And if you look at the case when the horse is present, which is the black line here, you can see that if the horse is present, you're more likely to find wild boar in areas where the cover of low shrub is rather low. But if the horse is absent, the trend is different, it's completely the opposite, and you will find more wild boar in areas that have more low shrub. And I wanted to continue this presentation by talking about the benefits of rewilding, but I couldn't do that without also mentioning that, of course, there are a lot of challenges that are associated with rewilding. For instance, the seed bank might be absent after the abandonment of agriculture. The land might be too degraded. Rewilding, of course, will increase the risk of conflicts between human and wildlife due to, for instance, depredation on livestock or damage to crop fields. Agricultural abandonment also means that there's going to be an alteration of the disturbance regime. And another challenge arises from the fact that the intermediate stage after abandonment are pretty vulnerable to perturbances, such as fire and invasions. So what are the consequences of abandonment and rewilding for biodiversity? Well, if you look at these studies that look at the impact of abandonment on species richness and abundance in the Mediterranean basin, they found that the effect was pretty mixed. There was no more positive than negative effect. In fact, if you look at the plant and animal richness, which are the blue and red line here, you see that the trend tends to be more positive for species richness when there is abandonment. And in fact, we identified several species that could benefit from abandonment and rewilding, this time at the European scale. Several species of birds, invertebrates, but also mammals. And clearly in this context, the biggest winners are megafauna, as you already heard. This graph here shows you population change between 1960 and 2005 of several megafauna species at the scale of Europe. And I'm not sure you can see the numbers, but several species, so for instance, the Eurasian lynx and the southern chamois had an increase in their population size by over 500% in this period of time. And so this is also relevant in Mediterranean system for several species such as the gray wolf, the roe deer, the red deer, the Iberian ibex, and also the wild boar, which had both an increase in their population size but also in their distribution range. But there's another species that can benefit from rewilding. It's our species. And we can see that when we look through the lens of ecosystem services. So clearly, if there's abandonment in a landscape, food production will decrease. But this could be done at the benefit for the supply of other services, for instance, regulating services such as carbon sequestration and water regulation. Rewilding can also benefit us through cultural services, and there's a lot of potential with rewilding for recreational services, with the development of, for instance, ecotourism or wild businesses that are linked with wildlife watching. On top of that, rewilding and the comeback of wildlife in Europe is associated with very strong cultural values, and I think this is what makes rewilding such a fascinating and interesting topic to study. And with that, I'd like to thank you.